So as you think about your own preaching life, what is one of the most difficult preaching experiences you may have had through the years?
So one of them, I think, was preaching a few days after 9/11 in 2001. So I was going to preach in the chapel at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. I was actually on staff there as an admissions director at the time, and I hadn't yet decided to go back to PhD school, but it was coming. But I was supposed to preach in chapel, and then 9/11 happened. I had this whole sermon I had been working on for weeks, and I was like, I was ready, right? And then in that moment, of course, I could not preach that. I had to just throw that out. Maybe I'll preach that a different day. But then, and at the time, there was so much, because this had just happened. Everybody was trying to find the reason. They were blaming, everybody who's Muslim. And so some of the witch hunts were happening in Muslim populations. And the depictions that were being cast on television were the innocent hands of the Americans and the very guilty hands of the Muslims who came, and they toppled, ran their planes into the Pentagon and then also in the buildings in New York. And it's like, okay, so I have to preach a sermon that, one, addresses the fact that 3,000 lives were lost. So we have to say that, and it's a tragedy. But we cannot then begin as a nation to do witch hunts on people who may worship differently. And so it was the difficulty kind of walking the line. Right? So there was a lot of grief happening in the country, but then at the same time, nobody's innocent in this whole process. And if you really want to think about our history in some of those nations, there are a lot of people probably have a lot of reasons to be mad at anybody who's American. So it was just trying to walk this fine line. That was a very difficult sermon to preach. But it was one that I think I wanted to preach because I wanted people to see the complexity of the whole situation and not scapegoat people who look different than they did. So it's that kind of thing. And so even in our world, sometimes as a preacher, we have to walk kind of the fine line to validate, to affirm people who have loss, but then at the same time challenge ourselves to be different, to be better, and to examine some of the ways we may have been complicit in some of the situations that we've created that could have been causal for some of those other things. So anyway, it's not always easy.
Yeah. Even as we think about preaching today.
Yes.
And the complexity.
And the complexities. Yeah. Like, even last week with mass shootings happen every day in our nation, but there were, 5 people were shot and killed in Louisville, Kentucky. And so it is, so one, you have someone who has mental health challenges. And so that is a reality. But then you also have a society where that does not have adequate gun laws to control who gets a weapon and who doesn't, because he bought that a few weeks before, even though he had mental health challenges. So what things do we put in place so that people don't have access to guns to carry out those types of mass shootings over and over again? And so, we have to preach both. Yes, mental health care is necessary and needed, but then there's also, if he were not a white male, would mental health care be the first place they go if he were a black male carrying out the same mass shooting, would he be characterized very differently? So complexities, right? So the reality of racism, all of that, sexism comes into our preaching moment as well. It's just not simple. But those are the kinds of things that I think we should address, and just be ready to get any kind of feedback we might get. But I think it's important for us to raise those issues so that we as a society, the prophetic preacher continually pushes us to be better, to live into who we say we are as the people of God. And if we really think that all people are people of God, are created in the image of God, then we will affirm all of humanity in our preaching in some ways. So I think that's important.